day, everyone. I am Twin Eliza V. Aladad, and I will tackle the Module 2 of Institutional Correction. So here is the topic outline. First is the history, the philosophy and objectives of punishment and the development of prisons, the Sing Sing prison, Auburn system, Pennsylvania system, 5 deployment of prisoner, forms of punishment, and the age of enlightenment. So and here also I will tackle the personalities behind the correctional institutions, which is Cesar. Next is Marquess of Vicaria Bonisaya, Cesar Lombroso, William the Conqueror, Enrico Ferri, and Clifford Shaw. First, we will tackle the Sing Sing prison. So, Sing Sing prison involves Sing Sing Correctional Facility. So, maximum security located in Ossining, New York. So, in use since 1826, and it's one of the oldest penal institutions in the United States. It is also among the most well-known in the country, especially notable for its harsh conditions within the 19th and 20th centuries. So, Sing Sing prison is originally known as Mount Pleasant Prison. It was constructed in the village of Sing Sing on the New York.
So, Sing Sing was also the site of reforms that affected the national penal system. Next, we tackle is the Auburn system. So, Auburn system, also known as the New York system and congregate system. So, is a penal method of the groups and were kept in solitary confinement at night with enforced silence at all times. The silence systems involved during the 1800s at Auburn Prison in Auburn, New York as an alternative to the modification of Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement, which it gradually replaced in the U.S. It's like to be prison in Auburn system. So, during the 19th century, prisoners had no rights. There in any opportunity to live or live comfortably. So, the Auburn system established several characteristics that were unique to the world of disciplinary conditions. So what it's like to be prison in Auburn system. So prison life in Auburn system. During the 19th century, prisoners had no rights, any opportunity to live semi-comfortably. The Auburn system established several characteristics that were unique to the world of disciplinary conditions. Silence was the biggest factor among rules for the prisoners. John D. Cray, a deputy warden at the Auburn prison, demanded that prisoners should be completely silent to take away the prisons or the sense of self. When the sense of self was taken away, many convicts obeyed the warden's sleep. So, the second characteristics of the Auburn system was community activities. During regimented times, during the day, prisoners had tasks to perform. Some of the tasks included making nails, barrels, clothing, shoes, and boots. So, lockstep and clothing at Auburn system. So, Elam Linds, in associate with John D. Cray, developed a revolutionary system of transporting convicts within the prison. So, the prison marched in unison and locked their arms to the convict in front of them. So, the prisoners had to look to one side and were not allowed to look at the guards or other inmates. So the clothing at the prison was grayish material with horizontal stripes. Next is the punishment. So in 1821, a new principal keeper, Elam Linds, was approved appropriated to run the prison in the belief of the disciplinary power of the lash, and used flogging to punish even minor infractions. So in 1839, a prisoner died from neglect and overflogging. So the committee of Auburn and staff members of Auburn Theological Seminary petitioned to bring the issue of the punishment to the state government. So the law stated that 6 blows on the naked back with a cut or 6-stranded whip was the most punishment that could be assigned for any offense. So in 1846, another meeting was congregated, abolished to use the whips. Flagellation could only be used for riots or severe cases. Next is the women in the prison. So in the early days of the prison, women inmates were held in the windowless office aloof the high security prison. They shared a single room and slept in the same area where they work, primarily at picking wool, knitting, and spoiling. In 1838, all women prisoners were transferred to the new female wing at the Sing Sing. So in 1892, the women returned to a new building at the Auburn prison. The Auburn Women's Prison remained in operation. So up until the 1933, when a new maximum security wing was for female opened at Bedford Hills. Next slides we will tackle is the Pennsylvania system. So Pennsylvania system, penal method based on the principle that solitary confinement fosters penitence and encourages reformation. So the idea was advocated by Philadelphia system, a society for alleviating the miseries of public prisons. Whole most active members were Quakers. 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary on Cherry Hill in Philadelphia applied the so-called separate philosophy. So prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in cells 16 feet high, nearly 12 feet long, and 7.5 wide. So unlike Auburn or Sing Sing, Pennsylvania system penitentiary in 1829 was intended to keep convicts separate even as they work. So in order to prevent any earthly contamination or distraction that might impede their repentance, hence the term of penitentiary. So in Pennsylvania, an exercise yard completely enclosed to prevent contact among prisoners was attached to each all. So prisoners saw no one exception, except institution, officers, and occasional visitor. So solitary penitence, however, was soon modified to include the performance of work such as slack-making or weaving. Another prominent visitor to Eastern Penitentiary was much more critical of the uncompromising solitary confinement approach. So after the Tory institution in 1842, Charles Dickens, the English novelist, concluded in his American Notes in 1842 that the Pennsylvania plan was cruel and wrong, saying he found that this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. So the earliest act providing for the solitary act of employment of inmates in prison workshops was enacted in 1789. This act provided that a special department for the Walnut Street Jail were to be designed to accommodate the employment needs of inmates while preventing communication amongst them. The Act of 1789 was superseded by the Act of 1790, which outlined the regulation of industries in the Walnut Street Jail. So this law regulated the hours and days of the week of the week, inmates were to work. Next, we will tackle is the 5 deployment of prisoners. So, the 6 forms of punishments are capital punishment, imprisonment, probation, restitution, fine, and community service. So, capital punishment applies to those who commit first-degree murder under extreme aggravated circumstances. The way of capital punishment is lethal injection or the electric chair. So, imprisonment, regardless of its purpose of incapacitation or rehabilitation is putting or in prison, taking away the freedom of offender for a specified amount of time. So, probation is when an offender is allowed to live within the community under strict supervision without incarceration. So, probation is sometimes combined with some type of electronic monitoring or house arrest. So, forms of punishment. First is the incapacitation. So, incapacitation seeks to prevent future crime by physically moving criminals away from society. Second type of punishment is deterrence. So, deterrence in relation to criminal offending is the idea or theory that the threat of punishment will deter people from committing crime and reduce the probability and or level of offending society. So the goal of deterrence is to persuade citizens and possible offenders of reoffenders to conform the rules of law. So Myth and Liu explain the 4 types of deterrence are generally recognized. One is specific deterrence, analyzes how effective punishment is on an individual future behavior. Next is the general deterrence, seeks to understand how individual punishment can deter other form of committing crime. Third is the marginal deterrence, seeks to reconcile how effective different types of punishment are as either specific or general deterrence. Fourth is the partial deterrence, refers to the situations in which the threat or penalty has some deterrent value even when someone engages illegal behavior. Retribution. So, retribution is one of the oldest form of punishment. Retribution has roots in a Judeo-Christian tradition of justice. In her book, Criminal Law, Lisa M. Storm explains that retribution prevents crime by giving victims or society a certain sense of satisfaction that a defendant has been punished appropriately, reinforcing the belief that the criminal justice system is working effectively. So, modern examples of retribution include the widespread practices of imposing fines as well as enforcing mandatory sentencing policies for certain offenses under the law. So, as an effective punishment, retribution has been criticized as being overly rigid and committed in the capacity of change societal behavior. So, rehabilitation. So, a common prison policy in America up until the 1970s, rehabilitation focuses on helping criminal and prisoners overcome the barriers that led them to the community criminal acts. This includes developing occupational skills as well as resolving psychological issues such as drugs, addiction, and aggression, explains the American. Next is the personalities behind correctional institutions. Cesar Vicaria, Marquess of Vicaria Bonisaya, Cesar Lombroso, William the Conqueror, Enrico Ferri, and Clifford Shaw. So, Cesar Vicaria in full name, Cesar Bonisaya Marchesi di Vicaria, died on November 28, 1749. Jose Delite El Depine was a celebrated volume on the reform of criminal justice. So, Vicaria was the son of Melanie, aristocrat of modest means. So from an early age, he displayed the essential traits of his character. A highly volatile temperament resulted in periods of intuitions followed by depression and inactivity. Beccaria later described that education he received there is fanatical and stifling to the development of human feelings, although he revealed a mathematical aptitude little in his student days gave an indication of the remarkable intellectual achievement that were soon to follow. So in 1858, he received a degree in law from the University of Pavia. Beccaria's treatise in the first succinct and systematic statement of principles governing criminal punishment, although in many of the ideas expressed were familiar, and Beccaria's indebtedness to such writers as the French philosopher Montesquieu, which he generously acknowledged, is clear. The work nevertheless represents a major advance in criminological thought. So the argument of the book is founded in the utilitarian principle that governmental policy should seek the greatest good for the greatest number. So he lashed out at the barbarical practices of this day, the use of torture and secret proceedings, the caprice and the corruption of magistrates, brutal and degrading punishment. So the objective of the penal system, he argued, should be to devise penalties only severe enough to achieve the proper purposes of security and order. Anything in excess is tyranny. Marquess of Beccaria Bonisaya. So Beccaria Cesar Bonisana Marquez. So an Italian economist and proponent of judicial reform, Cesar Beccaria was the author of the most famous Italian work of the Enlightenment, so on crimes and punishment in 1764. So he was born into a noble family of the state of Milan, which was part of the Austrian Habsburg Empire and was schooled by the Jesuits in Parma. So after receiving his return to live in Milan, Beccaria's 20s were the most important decade in his intellectual and emotional life. So he was temperamentally inclined to lethargy and anxiety, but when young, could also be galvanized by inspiration and express his feelings in the language of Rossio. So he married his first wife in 1761 against strong resistance from his family, and wrote on crimes and punishment in 1763 when he was 25. Beccaria assumed a prestigious public lectureship in the School of Palatine on the Cameral Sciences or Political Economy in 1768. So he mastered the literature of the nascent science of economics, and his teaching was impregnated by the Enlightenment idea of building a new science of humanity. So understanding the evolution of human society and improving the lives of entire populations. So the thrust of the work was also guaranteed to the individual citizen against arbitrariness, delay, secrecy, and useless and excessive violence. So in the codification of the law and application of penal sanctions, overall the book is all a sustained attack on the juridical culture of the ancient regime, as well as the sketch of the principles in which it ought to reform so as to produce the greatest happiness shared amongst the greatest number. The next person we're talking is Cesare Lombroso. Cesare Lombroso, Italian criminologist whose views, through largely decuded, brought about a shift in criminology from a logistic preoccupation with come to a scientific study of criminals. So Lombroso studied at the universities of Padua, Vienna, and Paris, and from 1862 to 1876, he was professor of psychiatry at the University of Pavia. So in 1871, he became professor of forensic medicine and hygiene at University of Turia, where he subsequently held appointments as professor of psychiatry and then of criminal anthropology in 1906. William the Conqueror. So William was the elder of two children of Robert and Normandy and his concubine Herliba. Sometimes after William's birth, Herliba was married to Herluin, Viscount of Canterville, by whom she bore two sons, including Odo, the future Bishop of Vaux, and at least one daughter. So in 1035, Robert died while returning from a pilgrimage to Syrian, and William, his only son, whom he had nominated as his heir before his departure, was accepted as duke by Norman magnates and by his overlord King I of France. He was moral and influenced by the standard of time, and he acquired an interest in the welfare of Norman Church. He made his half-brother Odo bishop of Bayeux in 1049 at the age of about 16. So, as Bishop, Odo combined the roles of nobleman and prelate in a way that did not getting greatly contemporaries. Next person is Enrico Ferri. So Enrico Ferri was an Italian criminologist, socialist, and student of Cesare Lombroso, the founder of Italian School of Criminology. So while Lombroso researched the purported physiological factors that motivated criminals, Ferri investigated social and economic aspects. So he served as editor of the Socialist Daily Avante and in 1884, so his book Criminal Sociology published. Later his work served as the basis of Argentina Penal Code of 1921. So although at first he rejected the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Ferri later became one of Mussolini and his National Fascist Party's main external supports. Lastly is Clifford Shaw. So Clifford Robe Shaw was an American sociologist and criminologist. He was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during 1930s and 1940s. And is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. So, the Age of Enlightenment, so also known as the Age of Reason or simply the Enlightenment, was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world of ideas of Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. So, centered on the idea that reason is the primary source of authority and legitimacy. So the Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that dominated the works of ideas in the Europe in 18th century. So the Enlightenment took hold in the most European countries, often with a specific local emphasis. So the cultural exchange during the Age of Enlightenment between particular European countries and also in both directions across the Atlantic. There were two distinct lines of Enlightenment thought. So the radical Enlightenment advocated democracy, individual's liberty, freedom of expression or education, and religious authority. So a second, more moderate variety sought accommodation between reform, the traditional system or of power and faith. Several ideas dominated Enlightenment thought, including rationalism, empiricism, progressivism, and cosmopolitanism. So rationalism is the idea that humans are capable of using their faculty of reason to gain knowledge. This was a sharp way from prevailing the idea that people needed to rely on scripture or authorities for knowledge. So next is empiricism, promotes the idea that knowledge comes from experience, observation of the world, and the progressivism is the belief that through their power of reason and observation, human can make unlimited linear progress over time. So this belief was especially important as a response to the carnage and upheaval of the English civil wars in 17th century. Finally, the cosmopolitanism reflected the Enlightenment thinkers' views of themselves as actively engaged citizens in the world as opposed to provincial and close-minded individuals. So, in all, Enlightenment thinkers endeavored to be ruled by reason, not prejudice. So, Ben Franklin, the symbol of enlightenment. The Freemasons were members of a fraternal society that advocates enlightenment principles of inquiry and tolerance. So, Freemasonry originated in London coffee houses in the early 18th century, and Masonic lodges, local units, soon spread throughout Europe and British colonies. One prominent Freemason, Benjamin Franklin, stands as the embodiment of the Enlightenment in British America.